whenever someone needs us. The American Red Cross responds to approximately 64,000 emergencies on an annual basis. This could be a flood, a fire, a tornado, earthquake, all of those in this region recently, or a hurricane response. But this is just one thing that the American Red Cross does. Tonight we're going to talk about the American Red Cross, the work that we do, how to be Red Cross ready, and if you're interested, how you can get involved. My name is Borysowski. I'm a volunteer services specialist with the American Red Cross. I've been with the organization for a little over 4 years now. For the first 3.5, I was a member of our biomedical services, which we'll talk a little bit about tonight, where I was responsible for managing and scheduling our biomed volunteers. So if you've ever been to a blood drive, the smiling, nice person who checks you in, donor ambassador, those are the people that I worked with. And then last July, our entire volunteer services across the country realigned, and I moved over to what we consider humanitarian services. So now I'm a member of the volunteer services team. So just to get started, does anyone know anything about the American Red Cross? Anything other than disaster response? Okay. We're going to talk.
And blood drives, right?
That's usually the two things that you hear. You can go out to events. So we're going to talk about all of it today, so hopefully you'll learn a little bit more by the end. So before we get to the American Red Cross, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the International Committee of the Red Cross. So before we were ever founded, the International Red Cross was created. There was a Swiss businessman named Henri Deneau. He was traveling through Europe in the 1850s. He was actually trying to meet with one of the grandsons of Napoleon, and he witnessed the Battle of Solferino in Italy. At this point, there were no medical corps, and there were reports that anywhere between 20,000 to 100,000 men were killed or wounded in just one day. And since there was no one to help take care of the men, Deneau organized volunteers. He made sure they had food and water, he wrote to their families, and he organized supplies. So after this happened, he writes a book called The Memory of Solferino, which he self-published, and it would get out. The Geneva Society of Public Welfare got their hands on it, and it was the subject of one of their meetings, and it became one of the first iterations and the first meetings of the International Red Cross. He also called for a society to be created that, with regardless to nationality, we would give aid. And then they had the Geneva Convention. 1863, there were about 14 countries that came and ratified it then in 1864. So then you may know the name of our founder once you hear it, Clara Barton. Yes, she gets confused sometimes with Florence Nightingale. Clara Barton is the founder of the American Red Cross. Just to tell you a little bit about her, she was a pretty incredible woman. She was born on Christmas Day in 1821 in Massachusetts. She was the youngest of 5. She had a lot of brothers. She got her nursing experience at a very young age. She nursed one of her brothers, David, back to health after he was in an accident. And that would be one of her 3 careers that Clara ended up having. When she was 18, she started as a school teacher. She would actually found a school where her brother worked, a middle school, when she was 24. And then in 1852, she founded the first free school in Bordentown, New Jersey. Unfortunately, this career of Clara's comes to an end. One of the schools hires a man. They pay him twice what they pay her. This is back in the 1850s. Clara says she may be willing to work for free, but if she's paid at all, she will not work for less than a man's pay. So then her next career was even more impressive. She goes on to be the first recording clerk to work for the U.S. Patent Office in Washington, D.C., the first woman to hold this position. In 1854, she was paid $1,400 on an annual basis, which doesn't sound like very much to us now, but was a lot of money back then. So she did that for about a year, making the same amount as her male coworkers. And then unfortunately, Robert McClellan became the Secretary of the Interior the following year. He opposed women working in government. So unfortunately, he demoted Clara to a copyist position, where she made 10 cents for every 100 words that she typed. So a big demotion from $1,400 on an annual basis. So she did that for a little while. Then unfortunately, President Buchanan, when he took office, she did not agree with his administration. So she actually sits that out up in Massachusetts. But one thing you'll learn about Clara is she was not very good at sitting still. So she does that for a little bit, President Lincoln is elected. She comes back to her position very briefly, but then the Civil War starts. So she very quickly finds her next calling. Being in DC, she was very close to a lot of the early on action. They actually had a train come from the Baltimore riot come to DC, and she starts her process where she begins collecting supplies. She eventually fills warehouses full of supplies. She would get permission later on to take these supplies to the battlefields and eventually to the field hospitals. So with no nursing experience at all, she begins this process where she collects supplies, gathers them, takes them to field hospitals, battlefields, nurses them in, and then repeats. Clara felt very drawn to this. A lot of the boys that she met were students that she taught when she was a teacher, particularly the 6th Massachusetts. She knew a lot of the men. So this is the beginning of the life of Clara's lifetime work and what will eventually be the foundation for the American Red Cross. Clara was at every major battlefield in South Carolina, Maryland, and Virginia. And I always like to let you know that because people ask if she was at Gettysburg. She was not at Gettysburg. She was in South Carolina at the time. You may also have heard her nickname, despite never having any nurse training. She was named the Angel of the Battlefield. And at one point, she was also named the head nurse of one of General Benjamin Butler's units. So Clara does this the entire war to the point of exhausting herself repeatedly, but just keeps doing the process over and over again. And then as the war ends, she wants to stay busy. And she, like I said, is not good at sitting around. She never really rests very well. So she is appointed by President Abraham Lincoln to start finding missing soldiers. So they create the Office of Correspondence with Friends of the Missing Men of the United States Army, probably the longest office title ever, on March 11th in 1865. And they received 63,000 requests of missing men during the Civil War. They are able to locate about 22,000 of these missing men, 13,000 of whom unfortunately died in Andersonville prison. Clara helps to make sure these men get recognition, helps to make sure their names are published. She testifies in Congress about her experiences during the war, and she actually travels throughout the entire Northeast and Midwest giving speeches. So another thing you didn't really see women doing very often in the 1860s. So after this, she's completely exhausted. Her doctor tells her to go to Europe and try to rest and seek a rest. So she does go to Europe, but then she discovers the International Committee of the Red Cross. And people are asking her, why don't we have a Red Cross in the United States? Why haven't we passed the Geneva Convention? So she learns about this, she takes all of the information home and begins campaigning here in the United States. So she would speak to several presidents, she wrote letters and pamphlets and gave lectures. She actually met with a couple presidents before getting Chester Arthur to finally sign the Geneva Convention, and then it was later ratified by the United States Congress. And that was in 1882. Slightly before that, May 21st, 1881, she created the American Red Cross. She was 59 when she founded our organization. And she would serve as our president until she retired in 1904. So we had a lot of really cool firsts, our first couple years of the American Red Cross. We very quickly had our first chapter open that same year in Dansville, New York. September 4th and 5th, we just came up on a big anniversary of this. In 1881, our first disaster response were Michigan forest fires. So we started very early on with that, serving disaster relief. We received our first charter in 1900, which states the purpose of our organization. We're here to serve as a method of communication between members of the military and their families and to provide disaster relief. Not everyone knows, because we do have a congressional charter, we are still an independent 501c3 organization. The government mandates that we do the work that we do, but they do not fund anything that the Red Cross does. In 1889, we responded here in Johnstown, Pennsylvania for the Johnstown flood, where unfortunately over 2,000 people were killed. Our first hurricane response came in 1893 off the coast of the Sea Islands in South Carolina. Clara sailed with other members of the American Red Cross in 1889 to Havana, Cuba. They took relief supplies to victims of the Spanish-American War. And then Clara would resign in 1904 after 23 years serving as the president of the American Red Cross. Just some other fun first. I really get into the history of the organization. There are so many cool things that we did. But our first honorary president, Woodrow Wilson, in 1913, became the first honorary president of the American Red Cross. Ever since, every commander-in-chief president of the United States has also served that honorary role within the American Red Cross as well. And they always declare March as Red Cross Month. We had a ship sail to Europe during World War I. During that time, we had women that were called gray ladies. They weren't medically trained volunteers, but they did pretty much everything else. They wrote letters, they read to the men, they tutored, they shopped, and just generally cared for them and tried to lift their spirits. During World War I, we mainly operated field hospitals in France at the request of the United States military. Then during World War II, the American Red Cross was the primary source of civilian relief supplies. And 1941 is when our blood collection first began. The United States military actually asked us to begin collecting it. So we would do that throughout the course of World War II, and then after the war, that program ends. The civilian blood collection that we have today started in 1948. And then by 1949, we had our first donor center open in Rochester, New York. And by the next year, we had 31 centers across the country. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of the blood production that we have going on now. So just a little bit about the organization. The American Red Cross, and this is on your little agenda, we're here to prevent and alleviate human suffering in the face of emergencies. We do this through mobilizing the power of our volunteers, the generosity of our donors. We have a much longer vision statement, but it touches on every single thing the Red Cross does. We're here to make sure there are safe blood products. We're here to make sure there's disaster response. We're here to help serve members of the military and their families, and that everyone is trained and prepared when there's a disaster, and that they're able to use their Red Cross skills to save lives. There are 190 Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world. American Red Cross is just one of them. We all live by 7 fundamental principles. And these are things that I always train our volunteers when they go out and represent our organization. The first one is humanity. We're here to meet everyone's basic needs whenever they need it most. Impartiality, the Red Cross will help anyone and everyone. We go out whenever we're called to respond. Neutrality, we don't choose sides. As I mentioned, independence, we're not a government agency, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. Volunteer service, this is huge for our entire organization, but particularly for me. The Red Cross is over 90% volunteer run. So for every staff member like me, there are 15 volunteers, and we absolutely cannot do the work that we do without them. So we have over 300,000 of them across the country. Unity, we can only have one Red Cross or Red Crescent society. It has to be open and available to everyone. And universality, we come together to restore humanity and to provide relief. So as I mentioned before, we talked a little bit about disaster relief. Disaster is one of what we call our 5 lines of service. So disaster and blood are usually the 2 things people have heard the most about. So we're going to talk a little bit about them, but also our other 3 lines of service as well. So everyone knows hurricanes, that the American Red Cross will respond. One of the things we do locally is respond to emergencies here. So all of the flooding we had last summer, if there's a fire in Phoenixville, we will have a volunteer come out in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. if that's when the fire is, during the day. They will be there. We come out and we're actually able to provide financial assistance on the spot. So if you are unable to get back into your home for 48 hours, the Red Cross can actually give you a debit card right there that can help you, if you ran out without your shoes. If you don't have any toiletries, we can help provide those. If you don't have any friends or family nearby, we can help you get up in a hotel for a night or 2, just to help get you started back on your feet. We also have other basic comfort, toiletries, toothbrush, shampoo, all of that. And then we usually see the Red Cross blankets. A lot of times, especially if it's in the winter, someone will be wrapped up in a Red Cross blanket. But these volunteers are there to provide all of that, but also just some comfort to know someone is there, someone cares that this happened. I went on my first response last November, the day before Thanksgiving, and to see someone really not be able to get back into their home. And the day before Thanksgiving, that they're not going to get the insurance started the next day. So just to be able to provide someone with shoes, there was someone that had some friends and family nearby, but they didn't know if it was gonna work out, so they were able to get a night in a hotel. Just knowing someone cares. That's one of the things that the Red Cross does. We do it for fires, flooding, we will set up shelters as well. We had a huge fire in Overbrook this past December, that we had a large shelter running for about 2 weeks in Philadelphia. So just one of the things that we do in addition to the hurricanes that you usually see our national response. 95% of the responders are actually volunteers, Red Cross volunteers, who sometimes they work full time and then they go out in the middle of the night and respond to a fire or a flood. And 90% of the things that we respond to are actually home fires. For fiscal year 18, our entire Eastern Pennsylvania region, which let me show you, all of the counties that are colored in. So all the counties around Philadelphia, Delaware, Montgomery, Bucks, Chester, Berks, Schuylkill, and up all the way to Susquehanna County is part of our region. So we have a pretty large territory that we cover. For the last fiscal year, we had over 1,000 disasters within our region that we responded to. We provided assistance for over 5,300 people and installed over 8,000 smoke alarms, and then trained 4,314 students in disaster preparedness. Since the most common thing that we respond to is home fires, we launched a campaign in 2014 called Sound the Alarm. So this is our attempt to be prepared and not just to respond. So this is a really fun event. We did one here in Phoenixville on May 11th. But we work with local businesses, we work with schools. Anyone in the community is welcome to come out and participate. And you don't have to be an official Red Cross volunteer. It's just a one-day opportunity. You come, we feed you breakfast and lunch, and you get a free t-shirt, which is usually a nice incentive as well. And for Phoenixville, we did one day. It was from 8 to approximately 1 o'clock. We made 132 homes in the community safer, and we installed over 372 smoke alarms with under 60 volunteers that came out to help us that day. We also have a really fun program if you have kids or grandkids called the Pillowcase Project. This was launched after Hurricane Katrina. During that, college students were putting all of their essential items in a pillowcase and fleeing their dorm rooms. So we started this program that's targeted 3rd through 5th graders. We go into schools, youth groups, Girl Scout troops, Boy Scouts, and they learn about thunderstorms and lightning and fire. And then they get a pillowcase at the end that they get to draw on, with the special fabric markers, things that make them calm and happy, pictures of their pets. They're all fantastic artists when they're in 3rd through 5th grade. And then they take them home and fill them with things that would make them calm, like toys and books, non-perishable food items that they can take if they would ever have to flee their home and go to a shelter. But they learn about having a rally point, staying out of their home. So we usually run into a lot of questions about pets, making sure that the pets are safe as well. But it's a really fun program that we do, and the kids seem to really enjoy it. Another element of our disaster response is the handout I gave you, Be Red Cross Ready. It's as simple as 1, 2, 3, get a kit, make a plan, be informed. So this goes into a little more detail. For example, some of the things you should have in an emergency kit, it's a pretty long list, so I don't like to read it to you when we go into a presentation. But things like non-perishable food items, water for at least 7 days for everyone in your household, prescriptions, a first aid kit. If you have cell phones, numbers for doctors, chargers. A lot of times nowadays we don't know the phone numbers of the people that we call, so it's good to have them written down as well. If your cell phone goes, you may not be able to call. Then plan, know what kind of emergencies affect your area. Thankfully here in Eastern Pennsylvania, we don't see a lot of hurricanes, but we have had a lot of flooding lately. We have had some tornadoes, and we have actually had an earthquake up in Reading. But just knowing what's going to affect your area and being prepared. And then share that information with friends and family and make sure that they're aware as well. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a Red Cross emergency app that you can download on your phone. It's a little bit less annoying than the automatic alerts that come out through the phone itself. It's a little less jarring. And you can set people up in different locations. So I have my grandmother, I have my parents, and it will alert me if any emergencies are coming to that area. And then it also lets you know if there's a shelter in that area, if you need to go. Here's a list of what's available that you can get to. So where I spent the first couple of years I was at the Red Cross is our biomedical services. Does anyone have a guess how much of the country's blood supply the Red Cross collects? Any ideas?
100%.
No, it's actually only 40% of the nation's blood supply. We have a lot of competition in different areas. There are regions of the American Red Cross where they actually don't collect blood products. Florida, for example, One Blood is the big collector down there. That's only about 40%. It seems pretty low, especially in Chester County. You probably drive past a Red Cross blood drive sign everywhere you go.
Yeah.
I know I drove past one on the way home tonight, and having one at St. Joseph's Church today. But it's only about 40% of the country's blood supply. Only about 10% of the eligible population actually donates. So if you are a donor, you've donated in the past, and you get lots of phone calls, that's usually why we're always in a need. The summer is always a big appeal. Schools, colleges and universities and high schools is a big part of where we get our blood supply, and they don't run over the summer. People are on vacation, so we are just always in need of blood. When something happens, it has to be the blood that's on the shelf. So, for example, that big nightclub shooting in Orlando a couple years ago, we had a huge blood drive with Preston and Steve from WMMR at the Valley Forge Casino a couple days after. And we literally had people out the door wanting to help, which is amazing, but it's not that blood that's going to go and help then people, you know, when something happens. Or if you're in a region and there's a hurricane and you can't have all the blood drives. It's nice with the Red Cross because you can actually cross state lines if needed. We can move our blood around as needed. Only about 45% of the population has O blood, and 7% are universal donors, O negative. We also have donor centers. It's hard to remember. If you've never been typed, too, it depends. We do have donor centers in the area as well. Westchester has one. These centers run 7 days a week, Sunday through Saturday, and they're usually open at least 7 hours a day. This is where we do a lot of our platelet and plasma collection. If you go to a regular blood drive in the community, they will usually only collect whole blood. And then what we call power reds. Power reds, if you are A negative, B negative, O positive, or O negative, and you weigh, as a woman, about 150 pounds, or a man, 130, you're able to give. These are really critical for cancer patients, for trauma. It's that blood that everyone needs on the shelf. So they actually are able to give 2 units of blood at one time. And then they only end up giving 3 times a year. So it cuts down on their time. We filter everything other than the red blood cells out, and then they get the saline and everything else back into their arm. So a lot of times they end up feeling better as well. Every time you donate blood, you can save up to 3 lives. So if you've ever donated blood, even once, that's making a huge difference. And we have a lot of donors who have been doing it their entire lives that are up to gallons that they've given with us. So just think about how many lives they're saved. Another line of service that I really didn't know anything about until I started at the Red Cross is our service to the armed forces. The most common thing people usually know about that, we have an emergency communication center.
I remember my father when he was retired and he was buying something, he used to get phone calls, must have been from overseas, I guess, and it had to do with the military.
Mm-hmm.
He would pass the information on.
Yeah, that's exactly what the Emergency Communication Center does. So it's open 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the stories you usually hear, you know, if there's a member of the military in your family, they're overseas serving, someone has a baby here at home. Yeah. A lot of times we can help bring them home. Sometimes you can make sure they have a video that they can watch. Same thing if there's a death in the family. So what this Emergency Communication Center is able to do is verify all of the information that you provide, make sure everything is as up to date as possible, pass it along to the military command. And then the military command and the service member will help to make the decision about bringing them home. They also do a lot of other work. We don't have any active military bases in our area, but regions that do, they work with the active military bases. We do have some work done in our VA hospitals. We also have a hero network where individuals are able to call in if they have any kind of problem. They're a veteran, a member of the military, a military family. They can call in, and it's kind of a casework service that they can help them with whatever it is that they need. We have a really cool program in our office in Reading. It is the only one in the country. It is funded entirely by our local United Way in Berks County. And we have volunteers who come in Monday through Friday. They're out of our office by 7 a.m. and they pick up veterans in the Reading, Berks County area and take them to their medical appointments at the Lebanon County VA. So for many of these military members or veterans, it's the only way they can get to these appointments. And then our volunteers will stay with them until their appointment is over, and then if they're coming home, they'll bring them back home. And then occasionally, if it's nice, like it's been this summer, and there's a fruit stand that they really like to stop at, sometimes it's the only time these veterans get to get out of their home. So we have some very wonderful, dedicated volunteers, some of which who are veterans themselves, who do this every single day. And I think they're honestly some of the happiest, nicest volunteers that we have. We also have training services, so you may have heard of that and just not associated it with the Red Cross. We have CPR, we have first aid, AED, basic life support. I know when I was little, I had babysitting training from the Red Cross. We do swimming, and we also recently started offering opioid and severe bleeding classes as well. And then our training services helps out with some of those alerts. During Hurricane Florence, there were about 12.1 million alerts that happened. So even though we are the American Red Cross, we also have an international arm as well. So some of the fun programs that we have here in the United States, we've been able to take internationally. We reached over 50,000 people with recovery programs and over 4,300 families with reconstruction. And supported 24 international disasters with responders, supplies, and financial support. So for example, that pillowcase project that I was talking about, we've taken that to 500,000 people in 16 countries, such as Vietnam. So just a little bit about some of our opportunities. The last handout that you have just generally has some of our different lines of service, ways that you can get involved with the American Red Cross. It's also on the agenda as well. Like I've said, if you've ever been to a blood drive, our donor ambassadors are those bright, smiling people. I always tell everyone they sandwich the staff. So they're the first person that you see when you walk in, and then they're the ones that say thank you so much for coming, have a wonderful weekend, that you see when you're leaving as well. We would not be able to do any of the work that we do without our disaster responders. We have volunteers who literally work full-time, get up at 2 a.m. and go out if there's a fire, and provide that financial assistance. We also have volunteers who, pretty much anything I mentioned they do. They're out installing smoke alarms. We have a woman in Schuylkill County who has installed over 2,000 by herself. She's very well connected. Everyone knows her in Schuylkill County, but if she knows you don't have a smoke alarm, you will have one. We also have volunteers who do pillowcase projects, who go into schools. And one of the things I didn't mention, we do also have casework and recovery services. So if you have a fire or you experience a flood, and you need more than the basic support, the Red Cross has a caseworker who will help get you set up with resources as well. We also have mental health and spiritual care volunteers, which are two of the hardest roles that I think we have. These individuals, if they're mental health, have to have their mental health license. They have to be, working in that field, or spiritual care. And they usually go out to some of the tougher responses. Unfortunately, some of the mass casualty. So for example, the shooting in Pittsburgh last year, we have volunteers who deployed to that. We also have lovely volunteers if you like to drive or you know someone who likes to drive. I know I don't, especially not into Philadelphia. We have volunteers who actually go to the blood drives and pick up blood and transport it back to the local center in Philadelphia. And then probably the more fulfilling role, volunteers who pick up blood in Philadelphia and transport it to the local hospitals. So we've had some pretty cool Red Cross stories come out of that, where individuals have been waiting for them at the hospital. Like, we needed that blood. We've also had a story of someone who got stuck in the elevator with the son or daughter of the person who was actually receiving the blood products. So they get a little more of that appreciation just because you see how desperately the blood product is needed. Same thing for our service to the armed forces. We have caseworker roles. We have a lot of training and stuff that they do as well. So that is pretty much it for today. Does anyone have any questions? I hope you all learned something about the Red Cross.
Yes, I had no idea. No idea that there's I have to share this. Too bad my daughter didn't come, because she'll be volunteering tomorrow. She loves to is volunteer. She'd be this smiling.
It's really fun.
A little annoying, after a while.
I used to go out when I was in blood to blood drives. We had some that were critical. We have some that are on buses, and that we really need someone to be able to handle the registration process. But I don't like them as much because you don't get to see people afterwards. I always told everyone my favorite is the refreshment area, and it's not because of the snacks, but we have good snacks. It's because you really get to sit and talk to our donors, and they'll tell you how long they've been donating blood, if they have a Red Cross story. I had a couple, one of my first blood drives 4 years ago, that compete on the bed. They donate together every single time, and they race to see who can give blood faster. But you just learn so much about people in that short, it's 10 to 15 minutes, and it really can make your day and make theirs too. Anything else?
Well, I homeschool my daughter, and we are with co-op and things like that. Do you ever do like a place where they could go for a field trip that I could contact you or organize?
Maybe. Let me give you a card.
Okay.
There's probably something, whether a tour of the blood center in Philadelphia or something like that.
Yeah, or I know because with the pillowcase thing, they're not at the school.
Yeah, but we could find somewhere else too if there's enough of them.
Okay.
We have a really fantastic volunteer in Chester County, and Kathy Mullen, who does a lot of the Chester County pillowcase projects.
Okay.
She's the one I got to witness. We actually were in the Phoenixville School District in November last year, and the kids just love it. And our volunteers all draw on their pillowcases, and they're not bad, but the kids are so good, drawing little cats and dogs. Yeah, let me give you a card.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else? Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.